Hello, and welcome to week 3. The topic for this week is Remixing the Real, Found Footage, Collage, and the Archive. So for this week, I asked that we watch Adam Curtis's 2015 documentary film Bitter Leak and a clip from Harun Faroki and Andrei Ujika's 1992 film Videograms of a Revolution. I also asked that we read two texts, Eva Kernbauer's Establishing Belief, Harun Faroki and Andrei Ujika, Videograms of a Revolution, and Jamie Barron's The Archive Effect, Archival Footage as an Experience of Reception. So a quick outline of the lecture. It's going to fit into two parts. The first will take up questions of found footage and the relationship to the documentary. I will discuss some of Barron's essay on the archive effect, and then I will turn to some examples of the use of found footage in the documentary. Part 2 of this lecture will return to Jamie Barron's article and take up in particular the question of what she calls, after Vivian Sobchak, the phenomenology of non-fictional film experience, and then turn to discussions of Videograms of Revolution and Bitter Lake, and then finally we'll look at a few questions and discussions that we can take up on Canvas as well as in our Microsoft Teams chat on Friday, which is tomorrow. So found footage and the documentary. Now found footage is perhaps one of the most ubiquitous and dominant forms in our contemporary moment of new media, or what's also called convergence culture. And so we can't really, in this lecture, take up all of the complexities of the question of found footage, but we can approach some of the aspects of it and attempt to come to a better understanding of how found footage functions in the documentary as we currently understand it. So first, a note on the term appropriation, which we can broadly understand as the act of adopting, borrowing, stealing, or otherwise reusing and adapting an object, element, document, or other work for new and or different purposes. Now, of course, we can also think about here what's called appropriation art, which has a long history in the 20th century that goes back to works like Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, in which he repurposed a toilet and put his signature on it and placed it in an art gallery. Or we could think about various dimensions of pop art, conceptual art, and so forth. Now, the use of found footage in the documentary, broadly speaking, is achieved through an act of appropriation. Now, there are different degrees, as Jamie Barron argues, of repurposing and transformation that found footage can undergo in its appropriation into a new context, work, film, etc. Barron identifies what she calls temporal disparity, which is to say a disparity between the different source documents, which can be images and sounds, that can be variously emphasized or de-emphasized or exaggerated or smoothed over, right? So the gaps between different found objects or images, they can be years and years apart and then suddenly combined or collided together and produce different effects and meanings. And she calls this temporal disparity. Related to this is what Barron refers to as intentional disparity, which can occur between an original meaning and a new contrasting meaning that can be variously emphasized or de-emphasized, exaggerated, or smoothed over in the new context of the new documentary work in our case. Now, found footage, as I already noted, is itself riven by what we can understand to be as a tension between the already established meaning of the appropriated source footage, its context, and the intentions that were there of the maker as well as of the people who may have been captured in the image or document, and then, on the other hand, the meaning and context of the new assemblage, which can come about by way of voiceover, recontextualizing factors, also including music, juxtaposition between different images, and so forth. So both the original intended meaning and the new meaning are further subject to the situated mode of reception of the spectator, which I will discuss momentarily and then take up further in the second part of this lecture when I discuss Vivian Sobchak and the notion of non-fictional film viewing. So Jamie Barron's The Archive Effect, archival footage as an experience of reception. So one of the key points that she makes early on in her essay is that there's an increasing interaction and blurring of boundaries between what we might understand to be the official archive and its documents, which are carefully prepared, maintained, codified, and so forth, and then amateur, non-professional, non-institutional found footage, anything that could be found on the internet, on YouTube, etc., or things even found 8mm, etc., things found on the street that can also be, as it were, found. And so she sees in the sort of 21st century, we're seeing this increasing kind of convergence or blurring between the sort of more traditional archival document and the more nebulous category of the found footage in things like online platforms, databases, collections, as well as in film and video festivals. And one of the key concepts that comes up for Barron is this notion of foundness and its relationship to authenticity, and the way that these films, found footage films broadly speaking, seem to play upon this notion of something being found, and that lends it a kind of authenticity or credibility, a kind of situatedness from a specific context. So authenticity, as Barron understands it, in many ways depends upon communicating this sense of foundness. And we can see, as we'll see in various examples in a moment, this sense of foundness can plays out in many different ways, and thus produces different kinds of authenticity or perhaps even inauthenticity. So one of the key concept from her article is, of course, this notion of the archive effect, which she explains as a kind of form of situated reception to an internal textual relationship between different materials. So that the play between inside of a given film that uses found footage and the play between the different appropriated documents that can be put together to produce this archive effect. She says, quote, "The archive effect, and hence the recognition of a document as archival, is a function of the relationship between different elements of the same text, between a document placed within a new textual context, and not of the relationship between a text and the extra-textual context in which it is shown." So, of course, she's saying basically, of course, we're going to have different responses to the different archival documents in different films based on when and where we see them, and that's always going to be changing based on the context in which we watch them. But what she's also trying to do here is to identify the way that the different films kind of try to control and establish a kind of archive effect themselves that then we as viewers bring our own contextualizing circumstances to. But films themselves have their own different ways of attempting to establish an archive effect based on their own internal sets of relationships, or what she calls their textual context. So then again, of course, this notion of temporal disparity comes up, which is to say that different moments of time are put into contact, right? So there's different temporalities that are brought together in this contemporary context of the film. And then, of course, there is the intentional disparity. And she argues that it can be seen as what we might see as a subversion of what we as viewers perceive or infer to be the original intended use of the document, right? So there can be, this is, Jamie Barron understands it as being on a kind of spectrum where there can be minimal degree of, as it were, intentional disparity, and then various ways that the intentions, the originally intended meanings and contents of a document can be increasingly, in her terms, subverted. And we'll see some different examples of this momentarily. So she concludes by saying and suggesting that this reformulation of archival footage and other archival documents, not as objects with inherent qualities, but in fact as constituted by the experience of the viewer of an appropriation film, opens up many avenues for thinking through epistemological, and in particular historiographical questions about how we come to know about the world, and in particular about the past. So these questions, epistemological questions, that's a fancy way of saying how we know what we know, right? How we know the world through an archival document, and then how we know that archival document in relationship to other archival documents that are recontextualized in a new assemblage, which is to say, right, a new documentary film. As given pieces of footage, she goes on, are used and reused in different films for a range of purposes, very different meanings, interpretations, and values may accrue to them for viewers of those films. However, it is, at least in part, the archive effect that constitutes the potential power of such footage. And finally, whether the experience of temporal disparity, which puts different moments in time into contact, or that of intentional disparity, which subverts what we perceive to have been the original intended use of the document, is dominant, the archive effect offers the promise of truth value, of a message sent from another time or place, even as it dwells only in the unstable field of a given viewer's perception. Okay? So we have inside of each of these documentary films this kind of tension between temporal disparity and intentional disparity as a result of this new context, this new film in which the materials are assembled and put together into new relationships. And then we have a further relationship between all of that and the viewer and their context in which they are engaging with the documentary film, which contains all of these temporal and intentional disparities. So this may be somewhat abstract, so I thought it's useful for us to look at some examples of found footage and the documentary. An early example of the use of found footage is in the great Soviet compilation filmmaker Esther Shub, such as her film The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty, which was released in 1927. Now, this film is notable for being constructed almost entirely out of stock footage. And Shub worked as an editor on several films before making The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty. She worked with other filmmakers or in the context of people like Dziga Vertov, or, of course, Sergei Eisenstein. And something that her film, The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty, shares with the films of Eisenstein and Vertov is this emphasis on montage. And through montage, she pieces together a narrative, a political narrative about the brutality of the Tsarist regime, which is to say, the society before the Russian Revolution of 1917. So what we have here then is, in this compilation film, an aggregate portrait of the various classes that made up the Tsarist regime. From the upper classes to the peasantry, the church to the government, all of it brought together on the brink of a great transformation. Another earlier example of the compilation film, which is we might say is an early modality of the found footage film, is Humphrey Jennings's 1941 film Words for Battle, which is a film made during World War II, a British film. Now, this film is constructed almost entirely from footage shot during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, so the early stages of World War II in 1939, 1940, 1941. And it was shot by various filmmakers and then assembled together by Jennings. Jennings pieces together a portrait of the nation unified by its common purpose and shared history, right? So there's this sense in which Jennings is bringing together various pieces shot by various people, and how this kind of parallels a nation itself that's composed of, we could see it as pieces that then kind of cohere together to produce this sense of unity. This sense of unity is part of the propaganda use of the film to demonstrate how everyday life was coming to coincide with the mobilization for war, with total war. And in this film, Jennings uses voiceover narration, a poetic voiceover narration that links the images together. So The narration quotes from Shakespeare and John Milton and Winston Churchill, so various well-known classical British poetry, but also contemporary political speeches, in order to produce an image, to produce a concept of the united nation. A more recent example, but going back into the past to World War I, is the filmmaker Peter Jackson, who you probably know from films like The Lord of the Rings. He did a film called They Shall Not Grow Old. Now, in this film, it is constructed entirely from newsreel footage shot during the First World War that was contained in the British Imperial War Museum's official archives. But a lot of this footage has never been seen by the public. One of the key interventions that Jackson performs here is the colorization of the black and white footage, which we could argue transforms our contemporary, our present day experience of the past. So to see the past, to overcome what we might see as a temporal disparity, seeing these black and white images, that's become very common, almost cliched to us now when we see images of, in this case, World War I. And when Jackson colorizes them, part of what he's trying to do is overcome, we might argue, a temporal disparity, and to bring these images that are 100 years old now into some sense of our contemporary experience, to make us feel even closer, right, to the experience of these soldiers during the trench warfare of World War I. Now, in contrast to Jackson's colorization of footage and his perhaps his attempt to overcome this gap of this temporal disparity, although, of course, we may also argue that there's another kind of disparity in the footage because Jackson is overtly colorizing it, which was not commonly done or wasn't done at the time, right? That it was a black and white film, so there might also be a sense of the uncanny. Nevertheless, we can see in the contemporary assemblage filmmaker or appropriation filmmaker, found footage filmmaker Bill Morrison, in his film Decasia, which was released in 2001, a radical kind of decontextualization of very old early cinema films assembled from the various archives around the United States and Europe. In this film, Decasia, Morrison appropriates decaying black and white footage. And in this way, we might see it as a decontextualization of the fragments from these various archival films, these short films, these narrative films, into a new non-narrative assemblage, right? So Morrison brings these pieces together. He doesn't so much build a narrative with distinct characters or a kind of clearly articulated argument. There's no voiceover, for example, wedding the images to a particular meaning together. But rather, there's an emphasis on the materialism of film and the fragment, which is to say that Morrison emphasizes the materiality of the stock of the footage, the celluloid, the film grain, and so forth, and the way it's being worn down. So Morris makes no attempt to recover the footage or to correct these perceived degradations of the image. In fact, they, in a sense, become the dominant content over time, which is to say then that this archival effect is produced, right, emphasizing the foundness of this footage. And as I mentioned, there's no voiceover, so this is a very impersonal presentation. It is simply a droning score, and I'll show you a clip in a moment so you can get a sense of that. And then we might see thematically that this film, while it's on the structural level, on the material level, composed of fragments, and also thematically it is itself about fragmentation, mortality, ruination, right? We could argue that these are some of the key themes of the film that emerge from this archival effect. So here's a clip from Bill Morrison's Decasia. Now, in distinct contrast to a work like Decasia, we could consider something like Ken Burns's 1990 series produced for PBS, The Civil War. This nine-part series is really what made Ken Burns famous, especially in the United States. And it uses contemporary cinematography in addition to thousands of archival photographs, paintings, and newspaper images set to music to teach people about the history of the Civil War, in a larger sense, the history of the United States. And a number of well-known actresses and actors lend their voices to the production as they read contemporary quotes from such historical figures as Abraham Lincoln and Stonewall Jackson. So, as I mentioned, this uses contemporary cinematography, which glides over the photographs, glides over these archival images, right? Zooms in, zooms out, and moves over them. And in this way, in the editing and in this camera movement, in conjunction with the voiceover, it produces what we might argue is a near seamless sense of transition that smooths over the temporal and intentional disparities that might otherwise manifest in this assemblage of all of these thousands of photographs, right? There is, of course, the classical, as I said, these actors perform classical expository voiceover narration as well as interviews. And so there is this sense that Barron also emphasizes for the Civil War documentary, this holistic integration of sources. In many ways, this is a very classical and classically constructed documentary series. Again, by way of contrast, we could think about Kevin Rafferty's, Jane Loder's, and Pierce Rafferty's 1982 compilation film, The Atomic Cafe. Now, this film, which the filmmakers have amusingly described as compilation verite at one point in an interview in the 1980s, compilation verite, which suggests a sense of a kind of purity of method, right? So we've been talking about cinema verite in this course before, right? Which is, roughly speaking, a sense of the camera must record the world as it unfolds before it in the present tense, right? This is traditional cinema verite, let's say. The camera enters the world and records the world as it unfolds in front of it. When the Rafferty brothers and Loder refer to their work as compilation verite, they're saying, well, they just used construct their film entirely from appropriated clips without commentary, and there's another kind of purity, right, of method. In this case, their footage, the original documents, are things like Cold War educational and military films about nuclear war, and as well as the threat of communism and various contemporary TV advertisements, showing post-war, consumer gadgets, things describing the wonders of suburban life in the United States, and so forth. As I mentioned, there was no voiceover narration, so the context and the meaning of the film and then the clips is determined by the juxtaposition of the shots. And this film, The Atomic Cafe, produces an ironic relationship to the past, right? So it brings out this intentional disparity between the originally intended meanings of the Cold War films and educational films and advertisements, which either tried to stoke fear or sell commercial goods in the advertisements. Now, when they're recontextualized in this documentary, we see them in a different light. We perhaps even find some dark humor in an advertisement telling us about the wonders of a toaster when suddenly brought up against a film about the menacing threat of imminent nuclear annihilation. Right, so this ironic relationship is strongly brought forth in this intentional disparity.